Hey everybody, here we are back to the map. And so a few things I want to say here. I have a lot of content on social media. Dan, you'll see, has and will have a lot more content. And that's because really more than teachers, we're developers. Like in the world of form, you would say like artist, songwriter, creator, more than anything. That's what we do. And so that can be a little bit confusing as you see maybe us as teachers or mentors, because there's this creative side where we're just a lot of it is having fun and expressing ourselves. And so the free non-duality teaching is not my social media in full. It is one playlist on YouTube. So you really want to be clear about that. Remember how I said in the beginning of this free non-duality teaching that context is so important? And it really is, because without good context, we just end up bypassing. Without kind of understanding what we're doing here, and people will say, well, doesn't that bring the mind in? Yes, but just for the purpose of understanding what we're doing, not for belief, but to help shape our practice and how we're looking at things. If we don't really know what we're to investigate here or why, we'll just do random things during spiritual practice that are generally run by the unconscious repression. So basically, what it means is if you don't have a good context, your default context takes over, which is the repression conditioning buried in your body here, dimension three. That runs the spiritual path. If you don't have a context that includes that understanding of how it runs the path, and this is obviously my non-dual teaching then. But before I start here, with the limitations of first dimension, I want to remind you that the context here is the free non-duality teaching is only the playlist on YouTube that's called free non-duality teaching. What I'm calling my free non-duality teaching isn't anything else. So that the podcast, that's not my free non-duality teaching. That's just Scott Killaby teaching exactly where he is, where I am with all of the work, all three dimensions. But see, I'm stepping into the YouTube experience just as a first and second dimension teacher to give you at least as much as other teachers give you, and hopefully a whole lot more for free. And so that's still limited for me because it's all dimensions and not everybody is ready for the repression work. So I'm just meeting those people who are in first and second dimension as a teacher, and that's limited to this playlist. If you're doing 3D repression inquiry and you're following along with a free non-duality teaching, I would say, why? Why are you watching me if you have a solid 3D practice, unless it's for context, which I understand. But you don't, if you're doing 3D repression inquiry, you're doing our most powerful work. For you to come here and do these inquiries, you'd probably be bypassing, unless you're just sitting it with me to regulate your system. And we can talk about that. So bring it up to me if you're doing 3D work and you end up paying attention to me here more, because that's probably, unless you're getting more context, the repression driving that. Okay. Do you remember how I've said for 8 years on YouTube, before I started this free non-duality teaching, is that every spiritual seeker should question their teacher? Remember that? When you start, and you should ask questions as to even why you're on a spiritual path. And so here we are, I'm starting this free non-duality teaching, and so you should do those things. You should question me with regard to what the path is, and obviously with regard to my own process. And well, I share it all the time, and I'll continue to share that. But the reason being because we don't want the trauma bond where a teacher who has repression guides people into a bypass, but nobody speaks up, or there's nothing that breaks that cycle. So by talking about trauma and repression with your teacher, you learn things about, whether they dismiss you, bad, really, or they're open to that, even if they use different words. So I'm open, and obviously, and we're also going to get to the question of why are you here? Because one of my biggest concerns about coming back to the non-dual teaching and the way that people do it is that people won't look at why they're here and why they sit with me or why they want to do this because they really can't. The motivations are buried in the repression. It's basically stay safe, get love until we get to the repression level. We're in a bypass, no matter how we look at it. So, why are you here is just something that I want you to journal for now. And as you go deeper with me, you're going to discover why you're really here. And that's all I'm going to say right now. And you need to discover that because it's important. Now, notice how I lay out the playlist and how I lay out the teaching. So I'm going to do, a segment of the teaching and then I'm going to stop and take a break for people to digest it. I don't know if it's going to be 8 weeks or what it will be, but I'll announce that. And notice how I'm doing it. Remember context. So the first live was very loose and just doing first and second dimension processing. The recent live, as you can see, mentioned really and did only, well, mainly first dimension, resting as awareness, being, allowing, recognition. And then I said in that live event that I'm going to follow that up this week with another video. And so if you're seeing this video on YouTube and you're wondering, what is he doing? Well, you don't want to watch this video out of context. If you're interested in the free non-duality teaching, go to the playlist free non-duality teaching and start from the beginning. I mean, you can watch this, but this is something that's happening within a series that people are doing. So for those people who are following along, we just did that Sunday live event in First Dimension. And I pointed to this for a reason, because in that live event, I just wanted to point to it, the benefits of being and noticing everything comes and goes to that and allowing everything. And so I spent that experientially with you. I didn't want to sit and talk about this while we're being together, see, too much. So now we can talk about it. And I'm just talking about the limitations of first dimension today. And I pulled up the map and you can go ahead and read it. We brought out this map in the beginning of the free non-duality teaching, and you saw the longer video on it. Now just read the first dimension and let's talk about the limitations of what we just did and of teachings and practices like that that don't prompt anything up, from the unconscious. Take a moment to read that. Sorry, I moved it on you. So it's just being together like we were on Sunday. We have to start to become aware of, why are we here and what are we doing? So we don't just do spiritual practice blindly here in this teaching. We, for example, I've encouraged you, or I'm going to encourage you in this to do a utility journal every day, where you see recurring forms of suffering, and you can start that now, write it down on your iPhone every day or a journal. When you see recurring forms of suffering, like the suffering in the left column there, in the first dimension, when you see shadows, just go Google shadows and you'll see what I mean. You can Google my article on Google called Shadows. Triggers in your relationships, addictions, compulsions, attachment, detachment, thoughts, thinking, sensation, contraction, pain, disease, depression. See, these are all the things that are visible in our lives. And as we sit together in first dimension, just resting as awareness, we become more aware of those things in direct experience, coming and going, in basically the form of words, pictures, feelings, sensations, arising and falling to awareness. But then man, and how we conceptualize things, we come back and say, well, that story that came and went, that I'm not good enough, is my depression. and we objectify that. And that removes us from the direct experience. Because when I sat with you the other night, we were just pointing to words, pictures, feelings, and sensations. That's what was happening. That's our direct experience. But when we're not living as awareness, we get identified with things like, I have an addiction, I'm an addict, identity, for example, or I'm depressed. And that keeps us in it because we're identified with that for a reason. So everything that arises to awareness, either when you're resting as awareness on your own, or sitting with me, or at a retreat with a teacher, or anywhere, is all safer than what you've buried. And as science says, what you've buried is producing that suffering, the shadows, the triggers, the addictions. Well, the bypass, I hope, becomes really obvious when you see that all this suffering is being produced and we're resting and allowing all of that. That's first dimension, letting things be as they are, do nothing, there is no one, that kind of thing in non duality. Meanwhile, in deep in our bodies, there's this repression producing everything that comes into awareness in first dimension, buried anger, hurt, or sadness, whatever you get on the test at repressiontest.com, that gets you on our newsletter for the 3D work. But you just must know when you're sitting here with me, whether or not you're doing that 3D work, that when you're sitting as awareness, there's unconscious repression producing the things that come and go into awareness. And all of it's driven by fear, core frozen fear, this red here, that, that comes from the repression, deep fear, of course, of being yourself and of death, runs throughout your experience through these lines. And in first dimension, when we're sitting together, it shows up as depression. Well, that doesn't look like fear. I mean, we know it is, but it doesn't really look like it, or addiction, or relationship issues or triggers, but it's all fear. But the fear is buried and it's frozen in trauma terms, which means it's old fear that you never felt. And it's a fear of anger or hurt, sadness. It's repression. And it's just your physical sense of separation now in your body. And that sense of deficiency because, well, you are deficient. You're missing those emotions that you buried that don't come up when we're sitting in awareness. So just understanding what's going on. See, and then when you're in first dimension with me, you don't think about any of this. If we're just sitting together like we did, we're just sitting and being and allowing. It's very simple, direct experience. But we don't want to do that in a way that has no context, because then we'll just very blindly rest and keep the repression hidden from ourselves, buried in the body as a contraction of the sense of separation, and then the suffering will continue, but we'll have the awareness there, you know. See, it has to be embodied because the stuff in the body is producing everything we're seeing in awareness. So you know the benefit because we sat together and you all have come here because of that benefit of just being. It's a benefit to no one, you could say, just being. But the limitation is there are all sorts of teachers that you're going to go to now and in the future that will do that kind of thing with you, but they'll never remind you or tell you that there's a repression in your body hidden, producing all those things, coming and going. And they may tell you to do one of the practices or to be with it in the way that first dimension teachings or teachers say, which is don't prompt anything up, don't dig, don't go to second dimension, whatever Scott Killaby means by that. Just be. There's no one here. There's no one to do anything or anything that they say. Remember that when we're in first dimension, there's a spiritual ego there because we have to keep the repression buried. So we're going to look at other practices like second dimension or third dimension as threatening, but we can't admit it. And so we'll couch it in spiritual terms and it'll sound really wise, like, oh, well, trauma is an illusion. You know, a teacher will say, or no, that's just, there's no body there. You're wasting, that's just the ego. See, that's right there is how they train you to avoid what you've buried because perhaps they did, like I did. And it's not healthy at all. I mean, it's really unhealthy to teach that way. But who knows it? When there's repression, nobody knows, and nobody's speaking up, and nobody's asking, why am I here? Well, like science says, I'm here because I have trauma and repression, and it's buried, and it's producing suffering, and I don't see what's going on when I'm just resting as awareness because it's buried. And this is why I'm going to take you into second dimension and then eventually third, so you can just do away with all of those viewpoints if you have them. When you're sitting with the first dimension teacher and they just encourage you, or you encourage yourself or discourage yourself from even doing any inquiry. Because if you do the utility journal, where recurring forms of suffering that come up in your daily life into awareness, just like the things on the list on the left, you start journaling every day. And if what comes up, for example, is I don't want to do Scott's inquiries or second dimension inquiry or anyone's inquiry, you have that right of free agency. But you want to check your body. A utility inquiry would be, what do I get out of saying, I don't want to do inquiry? As you're feeling into the sense of separation in the body, what do I get out of believing that I don't want to do inquiry? And then journaling means, as I've said, and I'll explain it more, just writing it down each day. So I don't want to do inquiry. You write that down. You do the utility inquiry. What do I get out of believing that I don't want to do inquiry? I just want to sit with this teacher in awareness. If you feel your body contract, listen. Repeat the inquiry several times until you hear what you're getting out of it, and then write it down without interpreting it, because that's the unconscious. And if you get anything other than stay safe, get love, that's your unconsciousness, because as I've explained and I will explain, there's science behind this about what you should find there. And that's your body. Science and the body mirror each other a lot here. So what you find is so important. So every day, if you don't find something like, I believe this, or I do this to stay safe and get love, or something like that, then please ask a question during a Sunday live event. Leave a comment here. I'm teaching and YouTube is my retreat, my satsang. Okay. So once you journal, then you start to see, oh, I'm getting something out of whatever the suffering is that's coming into awareness when I'm just sitting as awareness, right? And as you journal different forms of recurring suffering that come up early on this path, see, so I'm encouraging you to do it right away. And I'm even doing a video on it. You may have seen it, or it'll be coming, where I encourage you to do utility journaling on any of the recurring forms of resistance, for example, to going into second or third dimension, or resistance to inquiry, to practice, to being, any practice related sabotage. You write it down. What do I get out of believing that I'm already awake and I don't need anything? And if the body responds, you're getting something. What do I get out of that? You write it down. Now that's just for the sabotage, because there's a lot of things we tell ourselves when we're doing first dimension practice that comes from the repression. And that's how we don't embody it. We're self-protecting, but we don't know it until we do the utility journal, because we're saying to ourselves consciously, well, first dimension is enough, and that keeps us safe. Now, you would also journal in these weeks of our teaching together, or our time together, any other recurring suffering in first dimension that comes up, which just means throughout the day, as you rest as awareness, I've given you that instruction in the Sunday talks, you're just going to notice things that are recurring, like on the left, shadows, triggers, addictions, all that stuff. When it comes up, though, you're not going to call it an addiction, right? Because you're witnessing words, pictures, feelings, sensations, and awareness. So what you would do is you would just notice what's actually arising. For example, if, as I give the example of depression, well, in our direct experience, we don't really see that. We see words, pictures, feelings, sensations. When they arise, find the core beliefs or identities in that repression. And one good way to do that is just, for example, to say, I'm depressed. What does that mean about me? And that's called a boomerang. You can do it with anything, a person, a thing, a state. So here, depression, but it could be your mother. You pull that up in awareness and you say, what does that mean about who I am? Or what deficiency story comes up for me when I look at my repression or my mother? And then you listen and you journal all deficiency stories because those are core identities. And that's something that you can then do the utility inquiry on for journaling purposes. So, what do I get out of believing I'm not good enough? And then you listen and you write it down. And if you get anything other than stay safe and get love, that's your system very innocently hiding something from you. And I'll show you what that means. So remember, the clear instruction, the only instruction right now from this video is the utility journaling. And you'll see a video that has that in the title that gives you even more instruction. It's so important because basically that's the sabotage of spiritual practice is not knowing what we're doing, not having context as to how our practice is contributing to the avoidance pattern that this is why I say, why are we here? We're here to avoid emotion. We just don't know it yet. And so this work wants to show it to you, or we do. The work doesn't. Now, as you journal things and you see these utilities reflected back to you each day, and you listen to this, and it's just going to show you that, well, whatever this suffering is, I may not be conscious to the root of it yet, but whatever this is coming into awareness, every time I do the utility on something that reoccurs, it says the same thing, essentially, which is, I believe this, or I do this to stay safe and get love. And then you start to see, oh, well, so I'm getting something out of it. There must be some way that I'm creating it or that's being created, and it is. And that's where you see that in third dimension inquiry very directly. But you start to get hints of it here but there's still unconsciousness. It's not embodied when we're just sitting in awareness yet. So I'm trying to get you to see it by the utility journaling and through coming and sitting with me each Sunday and watching each of these videos. For now, just keep it simple. I just did, a Sunday night event where we sat in so-called first dimension. And then I invited you here to the next video. And all I'm saying here is because you don't want to get into the story, this is complicated, because we're just setting context. All I'm saying here is there's a bypass in what we did there. And when you do that, anytime in your life, sit with a teacher or on your own, and you don't prompt anything up, that's a bypass. But you may not know why, but you will start to see it after this video and utility journaling every day. Thank you for listening.